And to tonight's guest, veteran Middle East correspondent and author Robert Fisk. Following the release by Wikileaks of nearly 400,000 classified US military documents, Mr. Fisk wrote an angry piece headlined "The Shaming of America" in his newspaper, The Independent. He claimed the Pentagon's anger over the leaks was not because their secrecy had been breached, but because they'd been caught out telling lies. And he joined us just a short time ago from Beirut. Robert Fisk, thanks for being there.
You're welcome.
Now, what's the significance of the close to 400,000 secret US military documents that have been posted by Wikileaks as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think there are several very important elements to this story. First of all, the individual items, like, you know, there were witnesses, American witnesses to torture. They didn't do anything, that the Iraqis, security authorities were torturing Iraqis, that American airstrikes were killing many civilians. We knew about this, but it was always denied by the Americans. I was doing stories years ago about Iraqis torturing Iraqis, and the stories were coming from American officers who were leaking them to me. But of course, every time I wrote them in the paper, the Americans denied that it was true. I went to the scenes of US airstrikes. There were obviously, you know, limbs, hands, arms of children, babies, women, civilians, as well sometimes as armed men, and we wrote about this. What the WikiLeaks does is it proves beyond any doubt that what we reported was correct, and that what we were told by the American authorities was mendacious. It was a lie. Just remember, the Americans now are saying, shame upon WikiLeaks, it's endangering lives in Iraq. I mean, invading Iraq endangered an awful lot of lives, didn't it? But, you know, if these leaks, if these 400,000 documents had confirmed that the Americans did stop torture, that they didn't kill civilians in airstrikes, you know, US generals would be handing this stuff out free of charge to journalists on the front steps of the Pentagon. It's the fact that it proves how shameful our invasion and occupation of Iraq was, that this has come as such a blow to the United States, and only, I might add, to the West. You know, the reaction in the Arab world, when they looked through all this stuff in the Arabic language press, particularly in Baghdad, was, well, so what's new? We knew all this. We were the people being tortured. We were the people being bombed by the Americans. It's in the West that we're saying, my goodness, is that the case? So the generals lied. That's the big significance at this particular point of this. One bigger significance, I think, and it was Al Jazeera who actually picked this up, was that this famous 242 message, which tells US troops from higher headquarters, presumably Ricardo Sanchez when he was the general in Baghdad, which says, if you see abuse taking place, not by Americans, report it, but basically just do nothing. Al Jazeera found that about the time that message was put out, Donald Rumsfeld had a press conference at the Pentagon in Washington with journalists present who did not understand the significance of what he was saying, because when he did that, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in uniform, Pace, General Pace, was saying, well, if a soldier, we didn't know about the WikiLeaks, this is years ago, if a soldier sees someone being tortured, of course, he must stop it. And the camera suddenly switches to Donald Rumsfeld, and Pace's face falls at this point. He said, well, I think, Rumsfeld says, I think that, in fact, he doesn't have to physically intervene. He has to report it. In other words, at that point, Rumsfeld and presumably Sanchez have both agreed Americans would not intervene to stop torture. And that, of course, is against the Geneva Conventions.
Let's go back one step, and I'll come to more of the detail of the torture allegations in a moment. But to start with, these documents reveal 15,000 Iraqi civilian casualties that hitherto were unreported or undocumented. Now, what do you make of these numbers?
Well, look, the fact of the matter is nobody knows how many people have been killed in Iraq, and there are numerous reasons for this. If I can give you an anecdote of my own to show you why. In the worst period, when it was just beginning, the absolute total massacres in Baghdad, I was going in some danger on my own to the mortuary every day to count corpses. It's a very lugubrious thing to do at midday on a summer's day in Baghdad. And, for example, I found that the senior mortician, whom I was talking to and got very friendly with, told me that so many bodies were coming in and so many people were not claiming them because perhaps they didn't want to be associated or they were the wrong religion, that they were just throwing them into mass graves outside Baghdad, that when Americans brought corpses to the mortuary, the doctors were told not to perform post-mortems. Why was that, I wonder? Had they been tortured by other Iraqis and handed back to the Americans after being taken prisoner by the Americans? I don't know the answer. But all over Iraq there were mortuaries which were not taking the proper details down. Now, what we know from this 15,000 more than we knew about is just that we have the body count organisation, which of course is not allied with any military body, which comes up with various figures. And the figure of 66,000 dead, which is very small compared to what most people thought it would be, is 15,000 more than they had thought it might be. But I think what you've got to say is overall, calculating by the thousands who were dying every month, sometimes, you know, in just 3 weeks in Baghdad alone, I think we're talking about at least 150,000, probably much more than that. But again, you see, because you can't prove it, because you can't actually find it on paper, because there never was such a figure on paper, because it was impossible to get. I'm sure the Americans would try to hide it if they did. You simply don't know, and we won't know.
I'm just going to interrupt you there for a moment, because I want you to respond to what the Pentagon has actually said in its official response to this. It says the period, and you're talking about your own reporting, so the period covered by these reports have been well chronicled by news reports, books and films, and these field reports don't bring any new understanding to events.
Yes, they do. What the field reports do prove that the Pentagon was lying at the time and we were right. But what they're trying to say is, oh, it's an old story. We all knew about that. But the Pentagon was denying it all through those years. Their lies are not being chronicled by the Pentagon statement today. That's the point.
What's the scale of the torture contained in the allegations here? It seems that there, if I'm reading this correctly, 1,300 independent new US reports of torture by Iraqi police in police stations.
Look, this is just the reports that the Americans chose to put in. There will be many other cases where they wouldn't have sent them in because they were tired or they were doing something else or they were chasing some other incident. It is a fact, and I discovered this in police stations myself, and by talking to policemen, that if you got arrested, particularly if you were handed over by the Americans to the Iraqis as a suspected, quote, terrorist, unquote, you would be tortured. Now, maybe it would be slapped around. In some cases, the Americans themselves were smashing people around with plastic bottles full of water, and when the water broke, they slashed them across the face. But in most cases, they handed them to the Iraqis. It was a kind of domestic form of rendition. If the Americans caught someone in Afghanistan and couldn't make them talk, they'd ship them off to Morocco or Egypt, where they'd pull out their toenails, and then perhaps they would talk. So in a sense, this was a miniature rendition. The Americans caught people, they sent them to the Iraqi security services, they knew what would happen, well, they knew that 1,300 times it happened, and they knew very well that they would be tortured, and they were. And that's why so many Iraqis who've ever been arrested, when you talk to them in Baghdad, they'll say, yes, I was tortured, routinely, always and without exception. And that's the situation. These 1,300 figure doesn't actually mean anything. We're talking of tens of thousands of prisoners who've been brutalised and abused by the Iraqis with American knowledge. That's what we're talking about.
We saw with the revelations of torture at Abu Ghraib prison by Americans, so that it took some time for that story to really take hold. Is that what's happening here? And is there evidence, direct evidence in these new documents that the Americans actually turned a blind eye? You referred to that memo, the secret memo, Frago 242, as it's called.
Yeah, I mean, they were being ordered to turn a blind eye. They could report it. But the fact that the American administration and Ricardo Sanchez, who was the general at the time, he was the general at the time of Abu Ghraib, did nothing about it, means it was a blind eye. You've got to remember this has also been happening in Afghanistan, where prisoners taken by NATO troops, including Americans, have actually been executed or simply tortured to death by Afghans. The same kind of, again, domestic rendition. We're handing them over to you. We believe they're terrorists. And they disappear. Or they're tortured. Or they come out, sometimes. I had a very interesting conversation a couple of days ago with a former senior American officer in Iraq who was trying to justify what happened. He said, well, you know, we're all against torture, but in a war situation, we have to take a different attitude. And I said, what? Hold on a second. If you see someone across the road being tortured, your duty as a human being is to cross the road and stop it. Otherwise, you can be taken by a policeman to a court. He said, yeah, but that's okay as a morality he said, in London or Paris or New York. He said, but it's not the same when you're at war. And I said, but if it's not the same, why did you go to war to end torture? You know, it's a round-trip situation. But you shouldn't mistake the fact that these figures that we're getting are merely proof that the generals lied at the time. They're a very small version of what actually happened, because these are only the versions which we know that the Americans knew about, or chose to know about, or chose to report at the time.
Britain's Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, a Liberal Democrat who, to be fair, opposed the war in the beginning, says the allegations are extraordinarily serious, the allegations of torture. He wants them investigated. Now the Russians are calling for an investigation. The Danes are investigating whether detainees they handed over to Iraqis, I should say, were tortured. There's also a call from the United Nations for an investigation. Where do you think it's going to go?
Nowhere. You've got to remember there's a certain hypocrisy for the Russians to start talking about allegations of torture when during their 8-year occupation of Afghanistan they tortured even more people and killed even more Afghans than the Americans killed Iraqis. So, you know, I think there's a certain hypocrisy behind it all. It's good to see old, you know, Clegg in Britain calling for an investigation. It won't happen, and he knows that Cameron won't back it. I'm talking about the British Prime Minister and the coalition government in London. But it's good that we're hearing at least politicians saying this is terrible, terrible. I just wish they'd said it at the time, when, of course, we had Mr Bush denying it and Mr Blair denying it, and the result was that Mr Blair is now the peace envoy in the Middle East. Heaven spare us, but there we go.